Thanks, Elaine, for joining. I was introduced to you from your piece in the Irish Times. I do want to delve into that, but firstly, I just want to give you like a moment to introduce yourself, and I would love to hear more about what you do, what brought you into writing about sustainable fashion.
So my name is Elaine Maguire O'Connor, and I'm a consultant and writer working in the fashion law industry. So my kind of route into that was I came from a very traditional legal background. After my law degree, I went to Trinity and did a master's where I specialised in EU law, and then I worked in regulatory compliance for a few years. But I'd always loved fashion, and I really wanted to find a way to kind of combine the two. But at this time, like fashion law as a body of law wasn't really a thing, like the way you'd have sports law or entertainment law. At that time, fashion law, I think there was kind of a snobbiness to it, like, you know, women stuff, like it's not that important. I wanted to find a way to focus on it, and there was no kind of courses or anything at the time. So I had moved to London, and there's a master's program in University of Westminster focused on entertainment law. So I approached the course leader and I said, like, if I do this, would I be able to focus all my modules on the fashion industry, you know, kind of apply it that way? And they're very like open to that, and they said, yeah, sure. So I got to kind of immerse myself for a whole year just in fashion law and the different aspects of, you know, how the law relates to fashion. So a lot of the focus will be on IP issues, obviously, because that's the biggest, the thing that affects the most, and like contractual issues as well. But again, around that time, the Rana Plaza collapse happened, which really put a lot of media attention on what was happening in the fast fashion and the ethical issues around how clothing was made, etc. So I got very interested in that, and I guess I just started writing about it. Then from there, it was kind of a natural progression into like the sustainability movement. Like I said, I was quite interested in workers' rights, and then the last few years, with all the focus with climate change, there's been a lot of attention on how fashion does affect that. That is also kind of to do with the rights of, you know, people living in the global south, because not only are they abused in the kind of labor chain, but also because we export a lot of our waste to those countries where methane gas is then released into the atmosphere. So yeah, so it was kind of a natural progression, and then it just, you know, it's been a very much a hot topic of the last few years, so there's a lot of attention on it, and it's just kind of great to bring people's mind to it, just so they can be a bit more mindful of what their fashion choices mean.
I was going to actually ask you kind of what was that moment that like piqued your interest in sustainable fashion and how that relates to law. But I guess, as you said, like that horrible disaster,
like with the introduction of companies like Shein and Temu, like fast fashion has gone into like hyper overdrive. So there is so much more. Like it used to be companies like Primark and Topshop, but now like Shein and Temu have just like completely changed everything, and social media as well, because it's really created this culture of disposable fashion, I suppose. So like over the last few years, that's really taken off. Which again will be something that's piqued my interest and made me more concerned about it.
The demand, and like as you said, kind of this social media aspect has kind of amplified their advertising, and it just feels like it's at an uncontrollable rate at the minute. The piece that kind of I first like saw you from was about Ireland and its fast fashion addiction. How does Ireland compare in terms of like textile consumption and like fashion habits? Or shopping habits? How does that compare to the rest of the EU?
Yeah, it's crazy. So Ireland have a recent report showed that Ireland had I think it was more than twice the consumption of textiles of the EU average, which is crazy, and it was very surprising to me. I had no idea. Like I know obviously, you know, Primark or Pennies is an Irish company, and we've always had this kind of love of it, but I didn't realize the extent of our consumption that we're nearly twice the EU average.
From obviously I'm based in London, and I know it's really similar to the UK, and you are just bombarded with advertising. And even in the tube, I think like 2 weeks ago, I saw it was like stay on trend, or the tagline was something like that, and it was an ad from Shein. And then you'll get like misguided ads, boohoo, they're everywhere, like in out of home advertising on social media. It's like constant. Even like I would engage with like sustainable fashion content all the time, and I still get bombarded. So I can't imagine, like, you know, if you are shopping on these sites, how often you're getting that messaging. Is it like the advertising we're seeing, or do you think it is like a behavioral issue in Ireland? Like, why are we so addicted to fast fashion?
I think part of it, like Ireland is, so we're obviously, America is the king of consumption, and we're very much influenced in Ireland, I guess, because we all speak English. So culturally, like, we would watch a lot of American TV and movies, maybe more so than other EU countries where English isn't their first language. Likewise, the UK. So the UK are pretty bad when it comes to textile consumption as well, but because of Brexit, they're not included in the surveys, and historically we've always been quite culturally aligned with what's going on in the UK. So I think that is partly to do with it, is that kind of American influence. But also, like, in Ireland, like Shein, I believe, have their European headquarters in Ireland, you know. We invite a lot of this in under the guise of, well, they're providing employment, but, you know, there's a lot more to it than that.
This overlying issue of kind of greenwashing, I do want to kind of delve into Shein and talk about this, because I know you mentioned this in Time's Up for Greenwashing, that piece that you wrote. So you firstly kind of quite bluntly called out sustainable fast fashion as a myth, which I think is really interesting, and I love that you like said that so bluntly. Just to kind of go into the stats of, basically Shein announced this 250 million circularity fund, which is kind of like a vague term. So 200 million is being spent on partnering with this third party called Queen of Raw to source surplus or dead stock fabric from other brands. And then on that third party's website, they said that their partnership with Shein targets to rescue 1 million yards of excess fabric. And I believe that's from other brands. But like, that is crazy that, you know, this circularity fund, and like on the surface, it looks, you know, very green, and it is like the definition of greenwashing, but it kind of is alarm bells that, you know, how much are they producing to save or rescue 1 million yards of their supposed excess fabric? That is really crazy.
To me, it's all nonsense. Like Shein, it's completely, their business model is completely incompatible with any kind of sustainable ethos, because I read that they I think they add something like 10,000 new items of clothing a day, which they need to sell, and the only way they can do that is by encouraging, you know, consumers to do it via a huge barrage of advertising online, chasing you around the internet, using influencers, etc. So, and as well, they emit as much pollution as the entire country of Paraguay. So, like, how then can you say that, you know, you've got a green ethos? It was completely just for publicity, and they sent out that press release to everyone, and a lot of companies, you know, media will just have reproduced it, and then people have it in their heads because they're not, you know, obviously they're not thinking about it that much. I am, because it's my job, but you know, for the average person, they just hear, oh yeah, they're doing something sustainable, green, yeah, Shein must be good, which is exactly what they wanted, but I just don't buy it for a second. Another part of that fund was apparently going to work with like independent designers, which again is nonsense, because they, like, there's not a day goes by where I don't hear the story of Shein ripping off like some independent designers, or even like bigger other fast fashion companies. Like, there are always lawsuits coming out, and the independent designers can't afford to sue Shein. You know, they don't have any action really, and it can destroy their brands. So again, I'd be very cynical about any of that to do with Shein, to be honest.
Definitely, I saw that as well. That kind of I think they call it like an onboarding or something, Shein X designer incubator program, which I was saying, like, I see those videos and posts from really small, like, Etsy brands who absolutely don't have the funds to you know, hire a lawyer and sue Shein, this like massive company. So that is just really sad, and I think that's quite like ironic and a bit of a kick in the teeth to those small creators. But I also saw in a Forbes interview, their director of sustainability, her name's Catherine Watson, and she said that basically their like production is fueled by the demand for it. So she said that we're very targeted and actually only produce as many as needed. It's easy to then kind of go, oh, I'm sure, you know, there's people on the board, they have a director of sustainability, like they're definitely doing something behind the scenes, and then it's, you know, it's okay for me to buy. Yeah, it's an interesting conversation, like, where does the blame or like responsibility lie? Is it on the business? Is it on consumers? It's kind of, I'd love to hear what your opinion of that is.
I think it's the businesses and the brands that we need to hold accountable. Like, we do all have our own personal responsibility, obviously, you know, we can only do what we can do.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult for people to make the correct choice when they're being bombarded with all this misinformation, like this greenwashing. And these brands are spending millions on advertising, and a lot of it's quite subtle because they'll use influencers who, you know, you think, oh, you're like your friends or whatever, and they're like, oh, I just got this new outfit, but what they're essentially doing is selling to us. So I think for consumers, you know, it is very difficult to fight against this, you know, constant barrage of advertising. We spend so much time on our phones now, we can't escape it. So yeah, the responsibility absolutely lies with the brands, because they're the ones making the huge profits out of it. Interesting, there's an EU regulation that came in January. It's like a anti-greenwashing one. It hasn't been implemented in the member states yet, but it will need to be done, including in Ireland, by some stage in 2026. So that's going to ban terminology like green or eco or natural without concrete evidence to back up that it's true. The fines are pretty steep, so I think that is like a great step forward. At the same time, it probably wouldn't address like Shein coming out with this press release about their sustainability fund, because, you know, that's a slightly different method of greenwashing, if you like. But I do think, like in the advertising, you know, not being able to use that terminology is definitely going to be a step forward. Unfortunately, like, these brands are always seem to be one step ahead and find a way to get us to spend.
Definitely. I think like the barriers to entry as well, specifically because these fast fashion brands are so cheap, it's just the most accessible option for a lot of people is to shop in these brands. The brands are definitely responsible specifically for their like the fabrics that they use. I know like Shein, for example, vast majority of their products are synthetic fabrics, which are produced from oil. I don't think we need to go down why oil is bad. That responsibility solely lies on them to improve their supply chain. Another part of their circularity fund is like research and development into, I believe, like recycled polyester and something like that, but it's not something that they've even put into their supply chain yet. It's just something they're kind of
thinking about.
Yeah.
Obviously, from a consumer perspective, like, there are people that do need to use fast fashion because it is more affordable. Like people with small children, perhaps, like, you know, they grow very quickly and they have to replace their clothing, and I get that. And that's not where the main problem lies, though. It is, again, it's this pushing this idea that clothes are disposable and that you can wear it once and throw it away, when that's not the case. And that's exactly what they're doing, especially with a lot of the influencer marketing. And again, with the internet, like, I think young people today are, you know, they're showing themselves on screen like all the time, and they feel like they have to have new outfits to do this. And I think that's been pushed as well. Whereas in the past, like before, like TikTok or Instagram, you know, you didn't feel like you needed a new outfit every time you showed yourself online. So I think that's something that's also a problem and being pushed and exploited by these big brands.
Even from like when I was a teenager, wearing the same dress, you know, twice to the discos or whatever, it was like a sin. So yeah, I think that can only be like, you know, exponentially more difficult now that they're like posting all the time.
Yeah, and they know this and they're taking advantage of it. So
I also want to talk a little bit about high-end fashion, because there is this kind of illusion, I want to say, with like things that are made in France or made in Italy, that, you know, the supply chain must be this like really bespoke and like an old-timey process.
You picture like an artisan man in
in like a
little
studio
bush,
in the countryside.
Exactly, hand weaving something.
But you found that this wasn't the case, I believe, was it Armani Group? There was some like issues in their supply chain.
The industry, as it turns out, is just not as well, nearly as bad, possibly as bad as the fast fashion industry when it comes to ethical issues, which was a big surprise to me, because I kind of naively was like, oh, I'd avoid fast fashion. But, you know, I thought like the higher end brands, you know, if you buy less, buy a lot less, but buy at the higher end, was a much, you know, more ethical way to spend money. But now I've discovered that's not the case.
It is crazy. I think they kind of banked on that, but they're like, the demand versus supply is still like, they are producing en masse as well, like these big fashion houses, and they're not as like small batches. They they once were.
I do think at the higher end, generally, like clothes will last you a lot longer because they are better made than fast fashion. They're not worth what you're paying for them, but they are better made. So in that sense, it will last you longer. So I feel you're less likely to throw it away. Whereas a lot of stuff that you get from fast fashion brands literally start falling apart, so you can't wear them more than 3 times without, you know, disposing of them. So in that sense, it's a bit better. But it's more like the labor abuses is the problem. So Armani were discovered to be operating a factory on the outskirts of Milan, producing their handbags, which sell for €2,000. And it was like a filthy factory manned by immigrants who were being paid like €2 or €3 an hour. They were being forced to these horrible conditions, like 15-hour days, to produce them. But the shocking thing was that it was like just like miles away from the Armani headquarters. Because, you know, usually with these big brands, when they get caught in some kind of, you know, ethical issue, they blame the kind of complex supply chains, and they say, well, this happened, you know, out in Southeast Asia, we have no control because there's a number of subcontractors, etc. And they kind of use that to distance themselves from the problem. But here it was like, well, this is happening just a few miles from where your headquarters is. So they're like, I would find it very hard to believe that nobody in Armani knew that this was going on. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. LVMH are another one. So like they own obviously, like, you know, most of the luxury brands out there. They're headed by Bernard Arnault, who's the richest man in the world. They were discovered to be one of their subsidiaries, Laura Piana, I think that's called, producing these jumpers, which cost $9,000, which is obviously completely insane. The animals that provided the wool for them, which is like, they're called vacunas, and they're in Peru, and the farmers that were shearing these animals weren't being paid, like,
at all.
No, some of them were not getting paid at all. Yet these jumpers have been sold for $9,000, and Bernard Arnault is the richest man in the world. Like, it's horrible. It's just disgusting, and it really put a spotlight on the luxury fashion industry and their complete lack of ethics.
Can't even imagine, you know, how many people does that have to go through? Surely someone along the line is knowing that these workers aren't getting paid, you know, and I guess that, like, not questioning of that as well, and not being like transparent about their supply chain is like outrageous for something so expensive, as you said as well.
These brands have so much money that there is no way they can't employ steps along the way to make sure that workers are being paid. Like, there is just no way. I just don't buy that at all. They can say all they want, like, oh, it's such a complex supply chain. It was like, well, use some of that, you know, billions of dollars you have to make sure that this doesn't happen. Like, it's a very simple issue, but they just wash their hands of it, and they put enough distance between themselves and what's happening. So I don't know if so they can actually convince themselves that, you know, they don't know and they're doing no good, or if it's just, you know, because they want to make more money. But I just don't buy it. From
a like legal point of view, just because I'm interested, are there any regulation in place to kind of be open about transparency in the supply chain?
This year, like, we've seen the EU are really introducing like a lot of regulations that are trying to clamp down on these issues. But unfortunately, like the corporate sustainability directive, I think it is coming in shortly, and initially that's supposed to kind of hold companies accountable for kind of ethical and sustainable abuses in their supply chains. So if it happens anywhere in their supply chain, they will be held responsible, which sounds great on the surface, but the problem was what was initially proposed got greatly watered down as it worked through the various kind of policy makers, discussions, etc., because some of the member states, which would be very like pro-business, not that I'm anti-business, but just, you know, they don't want any kind of red tape because they say it hinders business, which isn't good for the economy. So by the time it actually got passed, it was heavily watered down. So it was initially supposed to capture companies, I think, that had like 1,000 or 500 employees, and that was raised to companies that had 1,000 employees and a turnover of $450 million. So ultimately, a lot of the companies that should have been caught will not be caught. I can already see like a lot of loopholes with the way companies will be able to get around it if they want. So if I can see them, I know that those companies will see them as well. So I think even though there are some steps being made, like being taken to address the issues, it's not really good enough.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can like a loophole I'm imagining is if they are employing these kind of subcontractors then who does the blame fall on, or does it encapsulate
Well,
that?
the idea is that it should encapsulate that
Okay.
it should get everyone down. But I find the issues with the turnover and the number of employees, because it's
Yeah.
possibly going to be easier for companies to set up other companies with might just fall under the threshold, so they're not held accountable. I don't know how it's going to work in practice, to be honest, but I can immediately imagine like some of the loopholes that will be available to them. It was very much a bare bones framework compared to what was originally proposed, and that happens a lot with these things. By the time you have so many different people with their input and how they wanted that, it ends up being quite different to what you initially envisaged.
So a step in the right direction, but not the full way.
Exactly. Yeah. In a way, others argue things like this actually make the problem worse, because it gives companies something to hide behind. They're like, well, we comply with the sustainability directive, so obviously we're fine. And it kind of gives them that kind of out. So some argue that it makes it worse. I don't know. I don't think so. I think we have to do something.
I can already kind of imagine the little logo at the bottom of the screen of any website being like, we comply.
Exactly.
Yeah. We've discussed, I know, kind of a lot there. It would be a good time to hear more about fashion IP law. I know you have some workshops coming up in London and Dublin, especially for people who don't want to go down a corporate law route. I think it'd be interesting to go into fashion IP law. It's definitely a gap in the market for sure, and something that's going to come up, I think, more and more.
I focus very heavily on education for small designers. I think just been giving them the tools to arm themselves from the beginning, from an IP perspective, just understanding the difference between trademark and copyright, design laws, and just knowing how they can protect themselves. Because for most small designers, they don't have the budget to go to law firms and lawyers because they're very expensive. So if they can have an understanding from the get-go of what they need to do, because sometimes there's some very simple steps they can do to help protect themselves, and as well, so they know when they need to get a lawyer, because there will be situations that you can't handle on your own. You're going to have to hire a lawyer, but just to know even when that is. So I like to work with designers on those kind of issues and kind of help them set out kind of an IP policy from the get-go.
How and where can people find your work? I know I'm going to leave links to some of the articles in the show notes as well. I know you have a blog and it is so interesting. I could just listen to you talk about it for hours, but how and where can people find the rest of your work?
Sure. So my website is wigsandgowns.com. So on that, I cover all sorts of areas of fashion law, from workers' rights, IP issues. A lot of it is just kind of focusing on the lawsuits that are happening, because in the fashion industry, people are always suing each other. So I provide up-to-date information on that. So just keep an eye out. I'm on Twitter at Wigs and Gowns as well.
Thank you so much for joining and for chatting with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted. It's so great to talk to somebody else who's interested in this, because it's a fascinating subject. I obviously think so.
I know, I could talk about it for hours and just get deeper and deeper.
There's so much to it.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking with me today.
No problem, Anna.
Bye.